Oh, sure. I mean, obviously they've changed over time. So you have kind of early on in terms of the media, things like the bandido, things like the sexy señorita, things like the Latin lover, that have persisted over time, but you also more recently have things like the Latino gangster, and those kind of earlier stereotypes kind of morphing into something different. And that kind of, they're kind of embodied, these stereotypes are embodied in different ways over time. But primarily there's this kind of idea that's recycled through all the stereotypes of Latino male criminality on one hand, this kind of over-sexuality on the part of Latinas or women, but also on both counts, this kind of foolishness or like lack of intelligence or kind of buffoonishness, right? So the buffoon is also kind of a recurring stereotype within the media that you see all the way from like Westerns in the 30s to something that's broadcast last week on television. So yeah, those are some of the recurring stereotypes, and I would say that the primary gender breakdown is like criminalization and over-sexualization in terms of men and then women. The image of the bandido kind of derives from these images of soldiers and revolutionaries in the Mexican Revolution. So the typical bandido that you see in the media and television, Westerns, things like that in the 20s and 30s, well actually starting in the teens, are the Mexican men with the big mustaches, the big hats, the bullets crossed, the bullet straps across their chest, and they're frequently characterized as violent, untrustworthy, dirty, kind of underhanded, so on and so forth. But what's interesting about the bandido too, in terms of this character, despite the fact that he's violent, untrustworthy, and kind of treacherous, he's also not very intelligent. He's also kind of inept. And he's inept relative to typically the white male protagonist, right? So that's how I kind of would distill the bandido. But the bandido also kind of changes over time from, say, its origins in the teens with what were called like greaser films, this kind of genre of Westerns that feature the bandido or the greaser, as they were called. And that ineptness or that lack of intelligence became kind of more highlighted over time. So that by the 1960s, it becomes something like the Frito Bandido, like a cartoon little bandido that was the focus of protests and boycotts of Frito-Lay. But he just becomes more of a ridiculous figure, someone who's going to steal your corn chips as opposed to kind of take your life, right? So that kind of ineptness kind of goes hand in hand with the violence on some level. So it's an interesting figure and one that's kind of changed, that has changed over time. As women, particularly if we're talking about Mexico, embodies that, or is kind of a stereotype that distills this idea about this larger relationship in some ways. But it is kind of this idea, or this concept of the sexualized Latina that moves across different kinds of stereotypes. So you have, like in the 20s and 30s, something called the cantina lady, the woman who is kind of implicitly a prostitute, that is kind of a momentary love interest for the white hero, but not suitable for a wife, of course, right? But exciting, titillating, it's very sensual. But I think that persists even into contemporary media, and the way kind of Latinas are characterized. If you think about someone like Salma Hayek as an example, someone who's always kind of displaying her cleavage, and these kind of expectations about, or these kind of ideas about like the sexualized women, and they're kind of then being like fiery or hot or spicy or something like that. So these ideas about sexuality, I think, apply both to men and women, but I think that it's more prominent over time in terms of Latinas, because even in the 20s you have the Latin lover emerging, and this kind of man that's obviously like highly sexual, this kind of highly sexual image. But even this concept and the way that this culture is perceived in terms of sexuality or its over-sexuality is, I mean, even something as subtle as the way they critique dances on Dancing with the Stars, right? So someone will finish a tango and Bruno Tamioli will say, that was fiery, that was hot, right? Or that was spicy. And it's like, but you're making a statement about your impression of Latino culture and what these dances actually mean, right? And the way they're linked to sexuality and the way that other groups aren't necessarily characterized in that way. In terms of changing stereotypes, the bandido doesn't necessarily appear that much anymore, and I think primarily because of the protest against it on the part of Chicano activists in the 60s and 70s. So they had a boycott against Frito-Lay, and I think it's also interesting that during this period, the bandido was used widely in advertising in the late 60s. I'm not quite sure why. The bandido and the sleeping Mexican. So advertising cigarettes, television. I have no idea why this is an appealing image or why it would make me want to buy a television, but it was used pretty widely. And I still haven't figured out why, but the boycotts against it kind of meant that particular stereotype was abandoned. But I would also say because these stereotypes are very much linked to social and historic context, that the bandido has in some ways been replaced by the Latino gangster, which makes this figure, this kind of stereotype, makes frequent appearances. Any dramatic television show, if you watch long enough, will have the Latino gang episode. I was watching Walking Dead 2 weeks ago, and they waited 4 episodes into the first season to have their Latino gang episode. They did it in a very interesting and intelligent way, but it's kind of replaced the bandido, and in some cases replaced even the black gangster figure. But I also think part of this kind of prevalence, and it is prevalent, there are entire casting companies in Hollywood dedicated to supplying the industry with Latino gangster types. So it is relatively prevalent, but I also think that is also an anxiety about immigration, right? About the changing demographics of the U.S. But what's persistent or consistent throughout that is this idea that remains about Latino men being criminal, right, and deviant. So that's the thread from the teens to the present day that kind of shifts through these stereotypes, but remains consistent throughout them on some level, right?